I never imagined I'd be the kind of grandmother who would cancel a $500,000 trust fund over a single devastating sentence. But when my daughter-in-law Elise looked me dead in the eye and declared, "You're banned from holding baby James until you prove you're mentally stable," while my son Marcus nodded in silent agreement, something inside me didn't break. It crystallized into the coldest, clearest resolve I'd felt in decades. The call came at 7:43 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in late September, jolting me from the peaceful routine I'd cultivated in my riverside cottage in Millbrook. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves and wood smoke as I sat with my morning coffee, watching the mist rise from the Millbrook River through my kitchen window. At 68, I'd finally found my rhythm after retiring from 35 years. As Millbrook County's chief financial officer, early mornings with my coffee and crossword, afternoon walks along the river trail, evenings reading in my favorite armchair by the fireplace. "Mom, we need to talk." Marcus's voice carried that familiar tension I'd been hearing more and more since he'd married Elise 3 years ago. "Can you come over this morning? It's about the baby." My heart immediately went to little James, my 6-month-old grandson, the light of my life since his birth. Every Tuesday and Thursday for the past 4 months, I'd driven the 20 minutes to their sprawling colonial and riverside estates, bringing homemade baby food, hand-knitted blankets, and all the love a grandmother's heart could hold. James would light up when he saw me, his tiny arms reaching out, his toothless grin melting away any stress from the week. "Is James all right?" I asked, setting down my coffee cup with hands that were steadier than they'd been in years, a fact that would become crucial later. "He's fine, Mom. It's just—" Marcus paused, and I heard Elise's voice in the background, sharp and insistent. "We need to discuss some concerns." I arrived at their house 40 minutes later, having taken extra care with my appearance. Something in Marcus's tone had put me on edge, so I'd chosen my best navy blazer over a crisp white blouse, paired with my pearl earrings, the ones Marcus's father had given me for our 20th anniversary. If this was going to be a serious conversation, I wanted to look like the accomplished, respectable woman I'd always been. The house that greeted me was, as always, a showcase of Elise's interior design ambitions. Every surface gleamed, every throw pillow precisely arranged, every family photo positioned for maximum visual impact. It was beautiful, but it had never felt warm to me. Not like the cozy, lived-in home where I'd raised Marcus, where family pictures accumulated naturally on every surface, and comfort mattered more than perfection. Elise answered the door holding James, his chubby legs kicking excitedly when he saw me. At 28, my daughter-in-law was strikingly beautiful in that effortless way some women possess. Long auburn hair always perfectly styled, clothing that looked expensive even when casual, and an air of confidence that bordered on superiority. She'd grown up in privilege, the daughter of a successful real estate developer. And sometimes I felt she saw my more modest background as a character flaw rather than a different life experience. "Gloria," she said, using my first name instead, of Mom as she had in the early days of her marriage to Marcus. "Come in. Marcus is in the living room." I reached for James instinctively, the way I had dozens of times before, but Elise stepped back slightly, adjusting her hold on him. "Actually, let's sit down first. We have some things to discuss." The first flicker of unease sparked in my chest, but I followed her into their pristine living room where Marcus sat on the edge of their white leather sofa, his laptop open on the coffee table. At 32, my son had inherited his father's tall frame and serious demeanor, but lately he'd seemed perpetually stressed, caught between his demanding job as an investment banker and what I was beginning to recognize as Elise's increasingly controlling nature. "Mom, sit down," Marcus said, gesturing to the chair across from them. "We need to talk about some concerns Elise has raised." I settled into the chair, my purse clutched a bit too tightly in my lap. Concerns about what? Elise remained standing, swaying slightly with James in her arms. When she spoke, her voice carried the tone she might use with a difficult client. Professional, detached, but with an underlying edge of condescension. Gloria, we've been observing some concerning behaviors over the past few months. Small things at first, but they're adding up to a pattern that we can't ignore anymore. What kind of behaviors? I asked, genuinely confused. Forgetfulness, Elise began, ticking items off on her free hand. Last week you asked me 3 times when James's next pediatrician appointment was scheduled. 2 weeks ago, you showed up on Wednesday instead of Tuesday for your regular visit. You've been repeating stories, sometimes telling us the same anecdote about your work colleagues multiple times in a single conversation. I felt my face flush. Everyone forgets things occasionally, Elise. And I came on Wednesday because you'd texted me that Tuesday wouldn't work. I never sent that text, Elise interrupted smoothly. I checked my phone. There's no record of any message like that. Marcus leaned forward, his expression pained but supportive of his wife. Mom, there's more. Dr. Patterson mentioned at the grocery store that you seemed confused when you ran into him last month. You didn't remember his name, even though he was Dad's doctor for years. My heart began to race. Dr. Patterson, I remembered the encounter differently. I'd been distracted, thinking about a shopping list, and it had taken me a moment to place him out of context. But confused. That wasn't how I remembered it at all. And then there's the financial concern, Elise continued, her voice taking on an almost clinical tone. You've been talking about that trust fund you set up for James quite a lot lately, mentioning the amount, the terms, asking us if we understand how it works. It's like you're obsessing over it. The trust fund. The $500,000 I'd carefully invested and grown over the past 3 years. Money from my late husband's life insurance and my own retirement savings, all set aside to secure James's future education and give him opportunities I'd never had. I'd been proud of it, yes, and I'd wanted Marcus and Elise to understand its significance. But obsessing? I mention it because it's important, I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil building inside me. It's James's future. Which brings us to today's conversation, Elise said, finally sitting down but keeping James firmly in her arms. We think you should see a doctor, Gloria. Get evaluated. Memory issues can be serious, especially at your age, and we can't risk James's safety. The words hit me like a physical blow. Risk James's safety? What are you talking about? You're banned from holding him, Elise said quietly, and in that moment, I realized this hadn't been a discussion at all. It had been a verdict. Until you can provide medical proof that you're mentally stable and capable of caring for an infant safely. I looked at Marcus, waiting for him to object, to defend me, to remember that I was the woman who had raised him, who had worked 60-hour weeks to put him through college, who had been nothing but loving and supportive to both of them. Instead, he nodded slowly. Mom, we're just being cautious, for James's sake. And that's when it happened. Not a breakdown, not tears or pleading, but a moment of absolute clarity. I saw the situation for what it truly was, a power play designed to diminish me, to make me prove my worth, to turn my love for my grandson into a weapon against me. I stood up slowly, my purse held firmly in my steady hands. I understand, I said calmly. I'll be in touch. As I drove home along the familiar river road, my mind was already working with the precision that had made me successful in my financial career for over 3 decades. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I knew exactly what I was going to do. The trust fund documents were in my home safe, along with all the legal papers I'd need. The phone number for my attorney was in my contacts. And unlike what Elise and Marcus seemed to believe, my memory was perfect, especially when it came to protecting what mattered most. They wanted proof of my mental stability. They were about to get a demonstration they'd never forget. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Back in my cottage, I poured myself a glass of the good wine, a bottle of Malbec I'd been saving for a special occasion. Somehow, this felt like one, though not in the way I'd imagined. I settled into my reading chair, the one positioned perfectly to catch the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows that overlooked the river, and let myself really think about how we'd gotten here. My name is Gloria Catherine Winters, and until this morning, I thought I had my life figured out. 68 years old, widowed for 5 years now, I'd built what I considered a good life in Millbrook. The town wasn't much to look at from the highway, just another dot on the map between Albany and the Massachusetts border. But it had been home for 40 years. The kind of place where the bank president knew your name, where the pharmacist asked about your arthritis, and where 3 generations of the same family ran the hardware store. I'd moved here in 1984 with my late husband Robert when Marcus was just 2 years old. Robert had gotten a job teaching high school mathematics, and I'd landed a position as a junior accountant with the county. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable, and stability had been everything to us then. We'd both grown up poor, Robert in rural Vermont, me in a cramped apartment above my father's failing grocery store in Syracuse, and we were determined to give Marcus something better. The cottage we'd bought was a fixer-upper on River Road, a 1920s craftsman with good bones but terrible plumbing and windows that rattled in every storm. We spent weekends for the first 10 years stripping wallpaper, refinishing floors, and slowly turning it into the home it was meant to be. Robert built the deck that extended over the river, and I planted the garden that now provided me with tomatoes, herbs, and flowers from April through October. Every improvement was planned, budgeted for, and completed with our own hands. After Robert died suddenly of a heart attack at 68, I'd considered selling the cottage. It felt too big, too full of memories, too much work for one person. But sitting in my reading chair, watching the river flow past the same way it had for decades, I realized the cottage wasn't just a house. It was proof of what could be built with patience, determination, and love. It was the foundation of everything I'd accomplished since. My career had been the other pillar of my life. Starting as a junior accountant, I'd worked my way up through the ranks of county government, eventually becoming the chief financial officer. It wasn't a glamorous job, managing budgets for road maintenance, school districts, and municipal services, but it was important work that required precision, integrity, and the ability to make difficult decisions under pressure. I'd overseen the county's finances through 3 recessions, 2 major infrastructure projects, and countless political upheavals. When I retired 3 years ago, the county commissioners had named a conference room after me. A small gesture, but one that meant the world to me. The financial skills I'd developed over 35 years had served me well in retirement. While other people my age worried about their savings lasting, I'd carefully invested Robert's life insurance money, combined it with my own retirement funds, and created what I considered a comfortable nest egg. More importantly, I'd set aside a significant portion specifically for James's future, the trust fund that had somehow become a source of suspicion rather than pride. Marcus had been the center of my world for so long that I sometimes forgot he was his own person now, with his own life and priorities. He'd been a good kid, not perfect, but good. Studious, responsible, occasionally moody like all teenagers, but never really rebellious. He'd gotten a full scholarship to State University, graduated with honors, and landed a job with a prestigious investment firm in Albany. When he'd met Elise at a charity fundraiser 3 years ago, I'd been thrilled. She was beautiful, successful, and clearly adored him. The early days of their relationship had been wonderful. Elise had been warm, calling me Mom almost immediately, asking for family recipes, and seeming genuinely interested in our family history. She'd grown up in Westchester County, the daughter of Jonathan Carmichael, who owned one of the most successful real estate development companies in the region. Her childhood had been spent in private schools, summer camps, and family vacations to Europe. A world completely different from the one Marcus and I had known. At first, I'd found her stories fascinating. She'd traveled to places I'd only read about, eaten at restaurants I'd seen featured in magazines, and moved in social circles that seemed impossibly sophisticated. But gradually, I began to notice that her stories always seemed to highlight what she'd had that we hadn't. The private tutors, the family connections, the opportunities that money could buy. When they'd announced their engagement, I'd been overjoyed. When they'd bought the house in Riverside Estates, a gated community 40 minutes from my cottage, I'd been impressed but slightly hurt that they'd chosen to live so far away. When Elise had started making subtle suggestions about my cottage being too isolated and not practical for someone my age, I'd begun to feel the first stirrings of unease. But it was when James was born that everything changed. Suddenly, I wasn't just Marcus's mother. I was the other grandmother, the one who needed to be managed, scheduled, and apparently now evaluated for competence. Elise's own mother, Susan Carmichael, lived in a luxury retirement community in Saratoga Springs. She was 72, impeccably dressed, and spent her days playing bridge, attending art lectures, and traveling with her wealthy widowed friends. When she visited Marcus and Elise, she stayed in their guest suite, brought expensive gifts, and seemed to effortlessly navigate the world of high-end baby gear and designer nursery accessories. I brought homemade applesauce in mason jars and knitted blankets that took me weeks to complete. I told stories about Marcus's childhood and offered advice based on experience rather than the latest parenting books. I was proud of these contributions, but I was beginning to understand that in Elise's world, they might be seen as quaint at best, inadequate at worst. The river outside my window caught the afternoon light, the same way it had when Marcus was small and would spend hours throwing stones from the deck Robert had built. This cottage, this town, this life, they had been enough for us then. They had been enough to raise a son who became successful and kind, to build a marriage that lasted 38 years, to create a legacy that mattered. But as I sat there with my wine, replaying the morning's conversation, I realized that none of that seemed to matter to Elise. In her world, I wasn't the accomplished woman who had managed million-dollar budgets and raised a wonderful son. I was just an aging woman who might be losing her mind, a potential threat to her perfect life that needed to be contained and controlled. The trust fund documents upstairs weren't just financial instruments, they were my last real source of power in this relationship. And if Marcus and Elise wanted to treat me like an incompetent old woman, perhaps it was time to show them just how competent I really was. Looking back now, I can see that the erosion had been happening gradually, so subtly that I'd initially dismissed each incident as a misunderstanding or an off day. But sitting in my chair with the wine warming me from the inside, I forced myself to confront the pattern I'd been too hopeful, or perhaps too naive to acknowledge. It had started during my first visit to see James in the hospital. I'd arrived with a hand-crocheted blanket I'd worked on for months, tiny blue and white squares connected with a pattern my own grandmother had taught me. The nursery was already overflowing with gifts: designer mobiles, organic cotton onesies, and a bassinet that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. When I'd presented my blanket, Elise had smiled politely and set it aside. "That's so sweet, Gloria. We'll definitely find a use for it somewhere." Somewhere. Not wrapped around my grandson, not displayed proudly as a labor of love from his grandmother, but somewhere. Later, I'd found it folded neatly in a closet, still with the tags I'd attached explaining the pattern's history in our family. The visits that followed had been carefully orchestrated affairs. Elise would text me the day before, never calling, always texting, with specific arrival and departure times. "Come at 2 p.m., plan to leave by 4 p.m. so we can maintain James's feeding schedule." If I arrived 5 minutes early, I'd wait in my car rather than disrupt their routine. If I stayed 5 minutes past the appointed time, Elise would make pointed comments about nap time and the importance of consistency for infant development. During these visits, I'd begun to notice how Elise positioned herself as the expert on everything related to James. When I'd suggest that he looked ready to eat, she'd consult her phone app that tracked every feeding. When I'd comment that he seemed alert and ready to play, she'd reference something she'd read about optimal stimulation periods. When I'd offer to help with his bath or diaper change, she'd explain that they had a system that worked best for them. "You understand, Gloria," she'd say with that patient smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Every baby is different, and James has very specific needs." The message was clear. I didn't understand James's needs the way she did. Despite having raised a child of my own, despite years of babysitting for neighbors and friends, despite the accumulated wisdom of nearly 7 decades of life, I was somehow unqualified to care for my own grandson without detailed supervision and instruction. The gift-giving had become another source of subtle humiliation. Every item I brought was met with polite thanks, followed by gentle correction. The wooden toys I'd found at a local craftsman's shop were lovely, but were trying to stick with Montessori-approved materials. The books I'd selected, classics I'd read to Marcus, were wonderful choices, but James's pediatrician recommends high-contrast images for his developmental stage. The homemade baby food I'd prepared using organic vegetables from my own garden was so thoughtful, but were working with a nutritionist to ensure proper balance. Each correction was delivered with kindness, each suggestion framed as educational rather than critical. But the cumulative effect was clear. Nothing I offered was quite right, quite enough, quite what James needed. The most painful moments came when other people were present. Elise's mother, Susan, would sweep in with professionally wrapped gifts from upscale boutiques, and Elise would exclaim over each item with genuine enthusiasm. "Mom, this is perfect. Exactly what we needed." When Susan would hold James, there were no concerns about proper support or safety protocols. When she'd suggest activities or make observations about his development, Elise would nod thoughtfully and take mental notes, rather than consulting apps or referencing expert opinions. I'd watch these interactions from my designated chair. Always. The same chair, positioned at a respectful distance from the main seating area, and feel like a guest in my own grandson's life. Susan belonged to their world in a way I never would. She understood the references to private schools and country clubs. She could recommend the right pediatricians and developmental specialists, and she shared Elise's concerns about maintaining proper standards and appearances. The breaking point of this particular pattern had come 3 weeks ago during what was supposed to be a celebration, James's half-birthday party. I'd thought it was a joke when Elise first mentioned it, but I'd arrived to find their home decorated with balloons and streamers, a professional photographer capturing every moment, and a handful of other young parents with their infants arranged around an elaborate display of age-appropriate toys and organic snacks. I'd brought a simple card with a photo of James that I'd taken during one of our visits, him laughing in my arms on the deck overlooking the river. It was candid, unposed, full of genuine joy. Elise had thanked me for it and immediately set it aside with the gift wrap and empty boxes, while the professional photos were displayed prominently and shared instantly on social media. Isn't it wonderful that James has such involved grandparents? One of the other mothers had commented, looking around the room. Both his grandmothers are so supportive. Yes, Elise had agreed. My mother has been invaluable. She has such good instincts about what babies need at different stages. The comment wasn't technically about me, but the omission was glaring. Susan had good instincts. Susan was invaluable. I was just present. Later that evening, when I'd offered to help clean up, Elise had politely declined. "That's so kind, Gloria, but you've done enough. Marcus can handle it." When I'd asked if I could take home some of the leftover food, beautiful catered items that would have fed me for days, she'd hesitated. "Oh, well, I was planning to send plates home with the other families. You understand?" I didn't understand. Actually, I didn't understand why my offer to help was declined while Marcus worked to clean up alone. I didn't understand why other families deserved the leftover food more than I did. I didn't understand why every gesture of love and support I offered was met with polite resistance rather than gratitude. But I was beginning to understand that in Elise's carefully constructed world, there wasn't really room for the kind of grandmother I was. She wanted someone who fit seamlessly into her vision of family life, someone who enhanced rather than disrupted her sense of control and perfection. I was the wrong age, from the wrong background, with the wrong instincts and the wrong gifts. And now, apparently, I was also losing my mind. The first direct challenge to my mental competence had come 2 weeks before the devastating conversation in their living room. I'd been having lunch with my friend Carla Henderson at Murphy's Diner, our usual monthly tradition that we'd maintained for nearly 15 years. Carla had been my closest friend since we'd both started working for the county in the 1980s. She, in the planning department, me in finance, and she knew me better than almost anyone. "You seem different lately," she'd said over her chicken salad sandwich, studying my face with the directness that had made her an excellent urban planner and an even better friend. "Quieter. More careful with your words." I'd been telling her about my recent visits with James, editing out the more frustrating encounters with Elise, when I realized what she meant. I had been choosing my words carefully, second-guessing my own memories and perceptions, constantly, worried that I might say something that would be used as evidence against me later. "It's just the adjustment," I'd said, not entirely lying. Learning to be a grandmother in someone else's house, with someone else's rules. But Carla had pressed further. "Gloria, you managed multi-million-dollar budgets for 3 decades. You negotiated with contractors, dealt with politicians, and never backed down from a fight when county residents needed you. This isn't about adjustment. This is about someone making you doubt yourself." Her words had hit uncomfortably close to home because she was right. Somewhere along the way, I'd started questioning my own judgment, my own memories, my own instincts. When Elise corrected me about something James needed, I'd find myself wondering if I was wrong. When she'd reference conversations we'd supposedly had, I'd rack my brain trying to remember if her version was accurate. When she'd make observations about my behavior, I'd analyze every interaction for signs of the problems she claimed to see. It was insidious, the way doubt had crept into my confidence. I'd started keeping a small notebook, jotting down important conversations and details about my visits, just in case I needed to reference them later. I'd begun arriving early for our scheduled visits and sitting in my car, reviewing what I wanted to say and how I wanted to say it, trying to avoid any statement that might be misinterpreted or misremembered. The memory issues Elise had mentioned during our confrontation weren't entirely fabricated, but they weren't what she made them seem either. Yes, I had asked about James's pediatrician appointment multiple times, but only because she'd given me conflicting information about whether she wanted me to drive them there or meet them afterward. Yes, I had shown up on Wednesday instead of Tuesday, but I had a text message from Marcus asking me to switch days, though when I'd tried to show it to Elise, I'd discovered it had somehow been deleted from my phone. The encounter with Dr. Patterson had been the most troubling because I genuinely couldn't remember it the way Marcus had described it. I remembered running into him at the grocery store, remembered a brief conversation about the weather and the upcoming town budget meeting, but I didn't remember seeming confused or failing to recognize him. Yet Marcus had been so certain about what Dr. Patterson had told him that I'd started wondering if I was losing pieces of my memory without realizing it. That uncertainty had led me to make an appointment with my own doctor, Dr. Ellis Montgomery, whom I'd been seeing for 20 years. At 73, Ellis was only 5 years older than me, and we'd developed a relationship built on mutual respect and shared experience with aging in a small town. "Gloria," he'd said after a thorough examination and cognitive assessment, "there's nothing wrong with your memory. Nothing wrong with your mental acuity. You scored better on the cognitive tests than most people half your age. Then why do I feel like I'm losing my mind? I'd asked, surprising myself with the vulnerability in my voice. Ellis had sat back in his chair, removing his glasses and cleaning them thoughtfully. Tell me about your family situation. How are things with your son and his wife? The conversation that followed had been eye-opening. Ellis had seen this pattern before. Older adults, particularly women, being made to doubt their own competence by family members who had their own motivations for wanting to establish control or create dependency. It's called gaslighting, he'd explained gently. Making someone question their own reality, their own memories, their own perceptions. It's often subtle, but it's incredibly effective at undermining confidence. He'd written me a letter that day, officially documenting my mental and physical health, stating clearly that I showed no signs of cognitive decline or memory impairment. I'd kept that letter in my purse for 2 weeks, debating whether to show it to Marcus and Elise, wondering if producing medical documentation would prove my point or just make me look defensive and paranoid. The final escalation had come just days before our confrontation, during what I'd thought was a routine visit. I'd brought James a new book, a classic children's story that had been Marcus's favorite when he was small. As I'd settled into my usual chair and opened the book to read to him, Elise had intervened. Actually, Gloria, I'd prefer if you didn't. Read to him today. I've been working with a speech therapist who's given me very specific guidelines about language development, and I don't want to confuse his progress. I'd stared at her, the book still open in my hands. Confuse his progress? By reading him a story? It's not personal, she'd said, her tone taking on that familiar, patient but firm quality. It's just that consistency is so important at this stage. The speech therapist emphasized that too many different voices and reading styles can actually slow down language acquisition. Marcus had nodded along, though I could see the discomfort in his eyes. Maybe you could just sit with him instead. Mom, he always likes having you here. Likes having me here, but not actively participating in his development, not reading to him, not feeding him, not contributing to his growth in any meaningful way. Just present, but passive, observed but not engaging. That's when I'd realized that the problem wasn't my memory or my competence, it was my role. Elise didn't want a grandmother for James. She wanted an audience for her parenting performance. She didn't want my experience or wisdom. She wanted my validation and compliance. And Marcus, caught between his mother and his wife, had chosen the path of least resistance. Instead of defending me or questioning Elise's increasingly restrictive rules, he'd simply accepted them as necessary and reasonable, leaving me to navigate the growing limitations on my relationship with my own grandson. The speech therapist's story had been the final straw in a pattern that had been building for months. Because I'd called Marcus's pediatrician the next day, and when I'd mentioned the concern about reading voices, he'd laughed. That's not a thing, Mrs. Winters. Reading to babies is one of the best things you can do for their development. The more voices and stories, the better. That's when I'd known for certain that this wasn't about James's well-being or my competence. This was about control, pure and simple, and I was tired of being controlled. Which brings me back to that Tuesday morning, sitting in their pristine living room, listening to my daughter-in-law systematically dismantle my reputation and my relationship with my grandson, while my son nodded in silent agreement. The words, "You're banned from holding him," hung in the air like a toxic cloud. I felt something fundamental shift inside me, not break, not shatter, but crystallize into perfect, cold clarity. This wasn't about James's safety. This wasn't about my memory or my competence. This was about power, and I was tired of pretending otherwise. Banned, I repeated quietly, tasting the word. From holding my own grandson. Elise's grip on James tightened slightly, as if I might lunge forward and snatch him from her arms. Until you can provide medical documentation that you're mentally stable and capable of infant care, yes. I looked at Marcus, waiting for something: protest, defense, even acknowledgement of how outrageous this demand was. Instead, he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, his expression pained but resolved. "Mom, we're not trying to hurt you. We're trying to protect James. If there's nothing wrong, then getting evaluated should be easy, right? Just to put everyone's minds at ease?" "Everyone's minds," I said slowly. "Whose minds exactly?" "Because my mind is perfectly at ease about my ability to hold a baby. I held you for hours when you were James's age. I rocked you to sleep, fed you, changed your diapers, and somehow managed to keep you alive and thriving without a team of specialists or a checklist of approved behaviors." Elise's expression hardened. "Times have changed, Gloria. We know so much more about infant development and safety now. What worked 30 years ago isn't necessarily what's best for children today." "What worked 30 years ago," I said, my voice gaining strength, "was love, attention, and common sense. What worked was grandparents who were trusted to care for their grandchildren without being treated like potential threats." "This isn't about trust," Marcus interjected. "It's about being responsible parents." I stood up slowly, my purse clutched, in both hands, and looked directly at my son. "Marcus, do you remember when you were 7 and broke your arm falling off your bike? Do you remember who stayed with you in the emergency room for 6 hours while they waited for your father to drive back from that conference in Buffalo?" His face flushed slightly. "Of course I remember, but do you remember who taught you to drive? Who helped you with your college applications? Who co-signed your student loans and then helped you pay them off when you were struggling to get established in your career?" "Mom, that's not—" "Do you remember who was there when your father died? Who handled all the arrangements, all the paperwork, all the decisions that needed to be made while you were grieving? Do you remember who you called at 3 in the morning when you were scared about proposing to Elise, worried that you weren't good enough for her?" The room had gone completely silent, except for James's soft babbling as he played with Elise's necklace, oblivious to the tension surrounding him. "That woman," I continued, "the one who raised you, supported you, and loved you unconditionally, for 32 years, that woman is apparently now too mentally unstable to hold her own grandson. Is that really what you believe, Marcus?" He opened his mouth to respond, but Elise spoke first. "Gloria, you're being emotional and dramatic. This is exactly the kind of behavior that concerns us. You're not thinking clearly about what's best for James." And there it was, the final perfect example of everything that had been wrong with this relationship from the beginning. I was being emotional and dramatic for wanting to hold my grandson. I wasn't thinking clearly for questioning their judgment. My decades of experience, my proven competence, my deep love for James, none of it mattered because I was challenging Elise's authority. I looked at James in her arms, his bright eyes and chubby cheeks, his tiny hands reaching toward me even as his mother held him away. This beautiful child who carried my genes, my husband's eyes, my son's stubborn chin, and I was being told I was a threat to him. "I see," I said finally, my voice steady and calm. "I understand perfectly now." "Good," Elise said, relief evident in her voice. "I'll give you the name of the neurologist my father uses. Very reputable, very thorough. Once you have a clean evaluation, we can discuss resuming supervised visits." Supervised visits. With my own grandson, in my own family, I walked to the door without another word, Marcus trailing behind me with apologies and explanations that I no longer cared to hear. At the threshold, I turned back to look at him one last time. "Marcus," I said quietly, "when you were James's age, I would have fought anyone who tried to keep me away from you. Anyone. I would have moved mountains to protect our relationship. I'm disappointed to learn that you don't feel the same way about protecting his relationship with me." I drove home in complete silence, my mind working with a precision and clarity that would have impressed Elise if she'd been able to see it. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I knew exactly what I was going to do. The trust fund documents were waiting in my safe, along with my attorney's business card. My hands, perfectly steady, completely reliable, reached for my phone to make the call that would change everything. I sat in my kitchen for exactly 10 minutes after returning home, watching the river flow past my window and letting the full weight of what had just happened settle into my bones. The cottage was silent except for the familiar sounds of home, the refrigerator's gentle hum, the grandfather clock in the hallway marking the quarter hour, the soft creak of old wood adjusting to the afternoon warmth. This house had seen me through every major crisis of my adult life. It had sheltered me through Robert's death, supported me during Marcus's difficult teenage years, and provided refuge during the hardest days of my career when budget cuts meant laying off people I'd worked with for decades. The walls held 40 years of memories, and sitting here now, I drew strength from their stability. But this wasn't a crisis that could be weathered by hiding in my safe haven. This was a problem that required action. I walked upstairs to my home office, a small room that Robert had originally intended as a nursery for the second child we'd never been able to have. Instead, it had become my command center, filing cabinets organized with military precision, a desk that had served me through decades of budget planning and financial analysis, and a safe that contained all the important documents of my life. The trust fund paperwork was exactly where I'd left it, in a manila folder labeled James's Future in my neat handwriting. I spread the documents across my desk and reviewed them carefully, my trained eye taking in every detail of what I'd created. The trust was worth $487,000 as of the last quarterly statement. I'd started it with $200,000 from Robert's life insurance, money that was supposed to be for my own security in old age, and had been contributing $2,000 monthly from my pension. Through careful investing and some fortunate market timing, it had grown into what any financial advisor would call a substantial educational fund. The terms were generous. James would have access to funds for any accredited educational institution, from preschool through graduate school. At 25, he'd inherit the principal, which I'd projected would be close to $800,000 by then, adjusted for continued contributions and conservative growth estimates. It was enough to ensure he'd never face the financial struggles that had limited Robert's and my own opportunities. More importantly, it was mine. Completely, legally, irrevocably mine until the moment James reached the specified age. I was the sole trustee, the only person authorized to make changes, and according to the documents my attorney had carefully crafted, I could modify the terms or even dissolve the trust entirely at my discretion. I'd set it up this way intentionally, remembering my own grandmother's stories about family money that came with strings attached, about inheritances that turned into weapons of control across generations. I'd wanted James to benefit from my planning, but I'd also wanted to maintain the flexibility to ensure the money served its intended purpose rather than becoming a source of family conflict. Ironic, considering where we were now. I reached for my phone and dialed the number I'd memorized years ago. "Richardson, Martinez and Associates," came the crisp voice of the receptionist. "This is Gloria Winters. I need to speak with Jonathan Richardson about making changes to a trust fund. It's urgent." Jonathan had been my attorney for 15 years, ever since he'd helped me navigate the complex legal and financial aftermath of Robert's death. He was thorough, discreet, and most importantly, he understood that money was never just about money. It was about power, family dynamics, and the values you wanted to transmit to future generations. "Gloria," he said when he came on the line, "good to hear from you. What can I help you with?" "I need to dissolve the trust fund I established for my grandson," I said without preamble. "Today, if possible." There was a brief pause. "That's a significant decision. May I ask what's prompted this?" I gave him the abbreviated version, the pattern of exclusion, the escalating restrictions, And finally, the ban on holding James coupled with demands for psychological evaluation. Jonathan listened without interruption, occasionally making what sounded like notes. "I see," he said when I finished. "And you're certain this is the action you want to take? Once we dissolve the trust, those funds revert to your personal accounts. You could recreate it later, but there might be tax implications and administrative complications." "I'm certain," I said. "At least, I'm certain that I need to have options. Right now, I feel completely powerless in my own family. The trust represents the only leverage I have." "Understood. I can have the dissolution paperwork ready by tomorrow morning. You'll need to come in to sign everything, and there's a standard waiting period. Can we expedite that?" "For an existing client with straightforward documentation, I can make some calls, pull some favors. We might be able to process everything by end of business tomorrow." After hanging up, I sat back in my chair and looked out the window toward the river. Across the water, I could see the old oak tree where Marcus had built a treehouse when he was 12, where he'd spent entire summer afternoons reading and dreaming about his future. I'd watched him from this same window, proud of his independence but close enough to help if he needed me. Now he'd chosen a life where I wasn't close enough to help, where my presence was seen as a liability rather than an asset. If that's what he wanted, I could respect his choice. But I didn't have to fund it. The decision felt both momentous and strangely peaceful. For months, I'd been reacting to their restrictions, adapting to their rules, trying to prove my worth on their terms. Now finally, I was acting on my own terms, reclaiming the power I'd voluntarily given away. James would be fine financially. Marcus and Elise both had excellent careers and wealthy families. He'd have opportunities and advantages that many children could only dream of. What he wouldn't have, at least from my side of the family, was the security of unearned wealth or the assumption that love came with automatic financial benefits. If they wanted to treat me as irrelevant to his life, then perhaps my money was equally irrelevant to his future. That evening, I called Carla and asked her to meet me for coffee. The next morning at Riverside Cafe, our favorite spot overlooking the harbor, I needed someone who knew me well enough to tell me if I was making a terrible mistake, someone who understood both my capabilities and my blind spots. Carla arrived 15 minutes early, as she always did, and had already claimed our usual table by the window when I walked in. At 70, she was still sharp as a tack, her silver hair cut in a practical bob, her keen eyes missing nothing. She'd retired from the county planning department the same year I had, and we'd become even closer friends without the pressures of work demanding our attention. "You sounded different on the phone last night," she said without preamble as I sat down with my coffee. "Calmer than you've been in months, but also harder somehow. What's happened?" I told her everything, the confrontation with Elise and Marcus, my decision to dissolve the trust fund, and my appointment with Jonathan that afternoon to sign the paperwork. Carla listened with the same focused attention she'd once brought, to reviewing development proposals, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just absorbing the full scope of what I was dealing with. "So they want medical proof that you're competent," she said when I finished, "but they've never actually witnessed any behavior that would suggest incompetence. They want you to prove you're not losing your mind, but they can't point to specific examples of you actually losing your mind." "Exactly. It's all vague concerns and isolated incidents that could have perfectly reasonable explanations." Carla leaned back in her chair, studying my face. "Gloria, I've known you for 40 years. I've worked with you under pressure, socialized with you, traveled with you, and been through major life changes with you. If you were developing dementia or serious memory issues, I would know. Anyone who spends time with you would know." "Thank you," I said, feeling a relief I hadn't expected. Sometimes I wonder if I'm being stubborn or naive, if there really is something wrong that I'm not seeing. "There's nothing wrong with your mind," Carla said firmly. "But there's definitely something wrong with how you're being treated. The question is, what are you going to do about it beyond dissolving the trust fund? That was the conversation I'd been hoping to have. Carla had always been a strategic thinker, someone who could see the long-term implications of short-term decisions. During her career in planning, she'd navigated countless political battles and family disputes over land use, zoning changes, and development projects. She understood how power worked in relationships and how to leverage it effectively. "I keep thinking about what you said the other day," I told her, "about someone making me doubt myself. I realize I've been playing defense for months, reacting to their restrictions, trying to prove I'm not what they claim I am. But maybe it's time to play offense." "What does that look like?" "I'm not sure yet. But I know I'm tired of being treated like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. I'm tired of having my competence questioned by people who've benefited from that competence their entire lives." Carla nodded slowly. "You know, when I was dealing with the Henderson family's property dispute, remember that mess that went on for 3 years? The breakthrough came when I stopped trying to convince them I was right and started demonstrating it instead. I stopped arguing and started acting." "How do you mean?" "They kept claiming the zoning laws were unclear and that my interpretations were biased against their development plans. So instead of continuing to explain the laws to them, I started applying them consistently to every other developer in the county. When they saw that everyone else was being held to the same standards, and when those standards were being enforced fairly across the board, they couldn't claim discrimination anymore. I considered this. So instead of trying to prove to Marcus and Elise that I'm competent, you demonstrate your competence in ways they can't ignore or dismiss. You build a life that's so obviously full and capable that their concerns look ridiculous by comparison." The idea began to take shape in my mind. For months, I'd been shrinking my world to fit their comfort level, accepting their restrictions, allowing my identity to become primarily defined by my role as James's grandmother. But I was more than that. I had skills, experience, and energy that extended far beyond my family relationships. "I've been thinking about volunteering again," I said slowly. "The Literacy Council has been after me to help with their fundraising campaign, and the Historical Society wants someone to organize their archives. 40 years of documents that need to be digitized and cataloged." "Perfect," Carla said, her eyes lighting up. "What else?" "Well, the community college has been asking me to teach a financial planning course for seniors. And there's that mentorship program for small business owners that could use someone with my background." As we talked, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: excitement about my own life, independent of my family drama. I'd been so focused on what I was being denied that I'd forgotten what I was capable of achieving. "The beauty of this approach," Carla explained, "is that it's not retaliatory. You're not punishing them or trying to make them feel guilty. You're simply living your life fully and letting them see what they're missing by trying to diminish you." By the time we finished our coffee, I had a plan that extended far beyond dissolving the trust fund. I would rebuild my sense of purpose and identity, demonstrate my capabilities in public forums where they couldn't be questioned or minimized, and create a life so rich and fulfilling that their approval became optional rather than essential. "One more thing," Carla said as we prepared to leave. "Don't tell them about any of this ahead of time. Let them discover your new activities naturally. The impact will be much stronger if they realize what's happening gradually, rather than feeling like you're trying to prove a point." I hugged her. Goodbye, feeling more like myself than I had since James's birth. The trust fund dissolution was just the beginning. The real power would come from showing Marcus and Elise exactly who they were trying to control, and exactly what they stood to lose if they continued down this path. 2 days after signing the trust fund dissolution papers in Jonathan's office, I walked into the Millbrook Literacy Council's headquarters with a confidence I hadn't felt in months. The building was a converted Victorian house on Main Street, its rooms filled with the comfortable chaos of an organization that did important work without much funding, mismatched furniture, overflowing bookshelves, and walls covered with thank you letters from program participants. "Gloria Winters, Gloria," exclaimed Patricia Chen, the executive director, rising from behind a desk that looked like it had survived several decades of nonprofit budget constraints. "I was hoping you'd change your mind about helping us with the capital campaign." Patricia was 50-something, energetic, and had been trying to recruit me for volunteer work since my retirement. I'd always declined, claiming I needed time to adjust to life without the demands of my county position. The truth was, I'd been so focused on my new role as grandmother that I hadn't wanted any commitments that might conflict with my availability. For James, "I'm ready now," I said simply. "What do you need?" What they needed, as it turned out, was exactly what I'd spent 35 years doing professionally: analyzing budgets, creating financial projections, and developing funding strategies for complex long-term projects. The Literacy Council wanted to expand their programs to serve 3 additional rural communities, but they needed to raise $200,000 over 2 years to make it sustainable. I spent the rest of the morning reviewing their current financial situation, examining their donor database, and identifying the gaps in their fundraising approach. It felt wonderful to be valued for my expertise again, to have people hang on my words because they respected my knowledge rather than questioning my competence. "This is exactly what we've been missing," Patricia said, as I outlined a preliminary funding strategy. "Someone who understands both the big picture and the details. Would you consider chairing our development committee?" I accepted on the spot, surprising myself with how quickly the decision came. For months, I'd been second-guessing every choice, worried about how it might be perceived or whether I was overstepping some invisible boundary. But this felt right, using my skills for something meaningful, being appreciated for what I could contribute rather than tolerated for what I might lack. The next week brought a phone call from Ellis Montgomery, the president of the Millbrook Historical Society. I'd known Ellis casually for years. He'd been Robert's golf partner and had served on various town committees, but we'd never worked together professionally. "Gloria, I heard through the grapevine that you're getting involved with community work again," he said. "We have a project that's perfect for someone with your organizational skills and attention to detail." The Historical Society had received a grant to digitize 40 years of town records, photographs, and documents, but they needed someone to organize and catalog everything before the digitization could begin. It was meticulous work that required both historical knowledge and systematic thinking, exactly the kind of challenge I'd always enjoyed. "The previous volunteer got overwhelmed and quit after 3 months," Ellis admitted, "but I think you'd find it fascinating. There are documents in there that tell the complete story of how this town developed, including some financial records from the early industrial period that I think you'd particularly appreciate." He was right. The first day I spent in the Historical Society's basement archive, surrounded by boxes of carefully preserved but randomly organized materials, I felt like an archaeologist uncovering buried treasure. There were town budget reports from the 1920s, correspondence between early mayors and state officials, and financial records from the textile mills that had once been Millbrook's economic backbone. More importantly, it was work that required exactly the kind of systematic thinking and attention to detail that Elise claimed I was losing. Every document had to be evaluated, categorized, and logged into a database. Every photograph needed to be identified and cross-referenced with historical records. It was intellectually demanding work that would create a permanent, public record of my competence. Within 2 weeks, I'd also accepted the community college's offer to teach a continuing education course called Financial Planning for Life Transitions. The course would meet Thursday evenings and cover everything from managing retirement funds to estate planning, topics I could teach in my sleep, but presented in a way that would help people make better decisions about their financial futures. The core irony wasn't lost on me that I was teaching other people about estate planning while simultaneously dismantling the estate plan I'd created for my own grandson. But the course gave me a public platform to demonstrate my expertise, and the students' respect for my knowledge was a welcome antidote to my family's concerns about my mental state. 3 weeks into my new routine, I ran into Susan Carmichael, Elise's mother, at the farmer's market downtown. I was buying vegetables for a dinner party I was hosting for the Literacy Council board when she approached my table, looking impeccably put together as always. "Gloria," she said, her tone polite, but cool. "I heard you're keeping busy these days. Elise mentioned you're involved with several organizations now." "Word travels fast in a small town," I replied, continuing to select tomatoes while we talked. "Yes, I'm enjoying being more active in the community again." "It's good to stay engaged," Susan agreed, though something in her voice suggested she found my sudden burst of activity suspicious rather than admirable. "Of course, Elise is concerned that you might be taking on too much. At our age, it's important not to overcommit. At our age." The phrase that had become code for "you're too old to be trusted with important responsibilities." But coming from Susan, who was 4 years older than me and still traveled internationally with her book club, it rang particularly hollow. "I'm finding that I have more energy than I expected," I said evenly. "The work is stimulating, and it's nice to feel useful, again." The conversation was brief, but I knew Susan would report every word back to Elise and Marcus. Let them wonder what I was up to. Let them question whether their concerns about my capabilities made sense in light of my obvious competence in other areas of my life. The quiet revolution was underway, and I was no longer the woman who could be dismissed or controlled. The call came on a Thursday evening while I was grading midterm assignments for my financial planning course. I'd just finished reviewing a particularly thoughtful essay about retirement planning strategies when my phone rang, Marcus's name appearing on the screen for the first time since our confrontation 6 weeks earlier. "Mom," he said, his voice carrying a strain I hadn't heard since he was a teenager dealing with his first real crisis. "I know things have been difficult between us lately, but I need to ask you a favor." I set down my red pen and gave him my full attention. "What's wrong?" "Elise's father had a heart attack this afternoon. He's stable, but they're keeping him in intensive care in Albany. Elise flew out immediately, and I need to join her tomorrow morning. The thing is..." He paused, and I could hear James babbling in the background. "Our regular babysitter is out of town, and Elise's mother is already at the hospital. We don't have anyone else we trust to watch James overnight." The irony was staggering. 6 weeks ago, they'd banned me from holding my grandson because I was supposedly too mentally unstable to be trusted with his care. Now, in their moment of genuine crisis, I was apparently the only person they could turn to. "I see," I said calmly, not making it easy for him. "And you're asking me to babysit James?" "I know we've had our differences, Mom, but you're family. You're the only family we have here who could handle this kind of emergency." Family. The word hung between us, loaded with all the contradictions of our recent history. I was family when they needed something, but not family enough to be trusted with normal grandparent privileges. "How long would this be?" I asked. 2 nights, maybe 3. "I'd bring him to your house tomorrow morning before my flight, and we'd pick him up as soon as we get back. I know it's a lot to ask, especially given everything that's happened." I let the silence stretch for a moment, considering my options. Part of me wanted to point out the hypocrisy, to remind him that they'd literally banned me from unsupervised contact with James just weeks ago. Another part of me wanted to simply say no, to let them figure out their own solution to the crisis they'd created by systematically eliminating their support network. But James was innocent in all of this, and my anger at his parents didn't extend to him. More importantly, this was an opportunity to demonstrate exactly what Marcus and Elise were throwing away with their controlling behavior. "I'll do it," I said, "but I have conditions." "Of course, whatever you need." "No," I interrupted. "My conditions." James stays at my house, follows my routine, and eats the food I prepare for him. No detailed instruction sheets, no hourly check-ins, no lists of approved activities. If you trust me to care for him in an emergency, then you trust me to use my own judgment about how to do it. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Mom, Elise has very specific routines for him. Marcus, I said firmly, you called me because you have no other options. I'm willing to help, but I'm not willing to be micromanaged while I'm doing you a favor. Those are my terms. Take them or leave them. Another pause. Okay. Yes. Thank you, Mom. I'll bring him over around 7 tomorrow morning. After hanging up, I sat back in my chair and smiled. For the first time in our relationship, I'd negotiated from a position of strength rather than desperation. They needed me more than I needed their approval, and that fundamental shift in power dynamics changed everything. I spent the evening preparing for James's visit, not by creating elaborate schedules or researching the latest parenting techniques, but by simply making sure my home was safe and welcoming for a baby. I moved a few breakable items to higher shelves, checked that the gates I'd installed on the stairs years ago for visiting grandchildren were still secure, and stocked up on basic supplies. Marcus arrived the next morning looking harried and grateful, James drowsy in his car seat, a diaper bag packed with enough supplies for a week-long expedition. I really appreciate this, Mom, he said, as he carried James into my kitchen. I know things have been complicated. James will be fine, I assured him, taking my grandson into my arms without hesitation. The baby settled against me immediately, his small body relaxing as if he recognized something familiar and comforting. Focus on Elise and her father. We'll manage things here. Should I call to check in? If it would make you feel better, I said. But it's not necessary. I raised a child before, remember? After Marcus left, James and I settled into an easy routine that had nothing to do with apps, schedules, or expert recommendations, and everything to do with paying attention to what he actually needed. When he was hungry, I fed him. When he was tired, I rocked him to sleep. When he was alert and curious, we explored the house together, looking at books, playing with simple toys, and spending time on the deck watching the river flow past. By the second day, James was completely comfortable in my home. He napped peacefully in the portable crib I'd set up in my bedroom, ate the simple foods I prepared without fuss, and seemed genuinely happy to be there. Most importantly, I felt completely confident caring for him, not because I was following someone else's rules, but because I was trusting my own experience and instincts. When neighbors stopped by and saw me pushing James in his stroller along the river path or playing with him in the garden while I watered my vegetables, they commented on how natural and relaxed we both looked together. No one questioned my competence or suggested I might be a danger to his well-being. To the outside world, we looked exactly like what we were, a grandmother and grandson enjoying each other's company. The real test came when Carla visited on the second afternoon and found me teaching James to clap his hands while he sat in his high chair eating pieces of banana I'd cut up for him. "You look like you're in your element," she observed, watching James laugh delightedly every time he managed to bring his palms together. "I am," I realized. This is what I was trying to explain to Marcus and Elise, that caring for children isn't about following a manual or checking off boxes. It's about being present, being responsive, and trusting your instincts. James chose that moment to successfully clap his hands 3 times in a row, then look at me expectantly for praise. I cheered enthusiastically, and he dissolved into giggles that filled my kitchen with pure joy. "If they could see this," Carla said softly, "they'd realize what they've been missing." "Maybe," I said, "but I'm not performing for their benefit anymore. I'm just being James's grandmother." Marcus and Elise returned on Sunday evening, looking exhausted but relieved. Elise's father was stable and expected to make a full recovery, but the crisis had clearly shaken them both. When they walked into my cottage, they found James sitting contentedly in my lap while I read him a picture book, both of us completely at ease. "How did everything go?" Marcus asked, though the answer was obvious from the peaceful scene before him. "Perfectly," I said simply, continuing to read until we reached the end of the story. James clapped his hands when I finished, a trick he'd learned during his stay, and both his parents looked surprised. "He learned to clap?" Elise asked, her voice carrying a note I hadn't heard before. "Was it regret?" "Among other things," I said, standing up with James still in my arms. He's been eating finger foods, taking longer naps, and generally being a delightful houseguest. As they gathered James's belongings, I noticed Elise looking around my cottage with new eyes, taking in the baby-proofed environment I'd created, the simple toys scattered on the floor, the high chair positioned near the window where James could watch the birds while he ate. "Mom," Marcus said as they prepared to leave, "I can't thank you enough. I know we didn't give you much notice, and after everything that's happened, James is my grandson," I said quietly. "Family helps family, regardless of disagreements." The word disagreements hung in the air, a deliberate understatement that acknowledged our conflict without relitigating it. Marcus nodded, understanding the olive branch I was extending. 3 days later, my phone rang. It was Elise. "Gloria," she said, her voice tentative. "I wanted to thank you again for watching James. I also wanted to ask, would you be willing to babysit again? Not for an emergency, just regularly. Maybe one afternoon a week?" The request caught me off guard. "What about your concerns regarding my competence?" There was a long pause. "I think I may have been overly cautious. Marcus told me about all the community work you've been doing, the Literacy Council, the Historical Society, teaching at the college. It made me realize that maybe my concerns weren't really about your capabilities. It was the closest thing to an apology I was likely to get, and I decided to accept it as such. I'd enjoy spending regular time with James," I said. "But the same conditions apply as last week. My house, my routine, my judgment." "Of course," Elise agreed quickly. "Would Thursdays work for you?" Within a month, Thursday afternoons with James became the highlight of my week. More importantly, the dynamic between Elise and me began to shift. She started asking my advice about things, not just baby-related topics, but practical matters where my experience was genuinely valuable. When James developed a persistent cough, she called to ask what remedies I'd used with Marcus. When she was struggling with work-life balance, she wanted to know how I'd managed a demanding career while raising a child. "I've been thinking," she said one Thursday as she picked up James, "about what you said regarding family helping family. I realize I haven't been very good at accepting help, or at recognizing when help was being offered freely rather than conditionally. The transformation wasn't complete or perfect, but it was real." The woman who had once questioned my mental stability was now seeking my guidance. The grandson I'd been banned from holding was spending entire afternoons in my care. And I was no longer the supplicant in our family dynamic. I was the respected elder whose wisdom and experience were valued rather than feared. The final transformation came 6 months after that devastating Tuesday morning when I'd been banned from holding my grandson. I was in my kitchen preparing dinner when Marcus called with an unexpected invitation. "Mom, we're having a small dinner party this Saturday. Some colleagues from work, a few neighbors. Would you like to join us? Elise specifically asked me to invite you." The invitation itself was significant, but what struck me more was the tone. Marcus wasn't asking out of obligation or guilt. He sounded genuinely pleased to include me in their social circle. Saturday evening, I arrived at their house carrying a homemade apple tart, the same recipe I'd been making for decades, but which now seemed to be appreciated rather than politely tolerated. Elise greeted me at the door with what appeared to be genuine warmth. "Gloria, I'm so glad you could come. I want you to meet some of our friends." The evening that followed was a revelation. Instead of being positioned as Marcus's aging mother who needed to be managed and monitored, I was introduced as an accomplished professional with interesting insights and valuable experience. When the conversation turned to community development, Elise mentioned my work with the Historical Society. When someone brought up financial planning, Marcus proudly described my teaching at the community college. "You should see the student evaluations she gets," he told the group. "They love her classes because she explains complex concepts in ways that actually make sense." But the most meaningful moment came near the end of the evening, after most of the guests had left. I was helping clear dishes when Elise touched my arm gently. "Gloria, could we talk privately for a moment?" We stepped out onto their back patio, the same space where I'd once felt so uncomfortable and unwelcome. Now, in the soft light of their outdoor lanterns, Elise looked younger and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. "I owe you an apology," she said without preamble. "A real one, not the careful non-apologies I've been offering." I waited, letting her find her words. "When James was born, I was terrified," she continued. "Terrified of making mistakes, of not being good enough, of failing at the most important thing I'd ever done. And instead of recognizing that you were trying to help and support me, I saw you as competition, someone who might expose my inexperience or make me look incompetent." The honesty in her voice was startling. This wasn't the composed, controlling woman I'd been dealing with for months. I convinced myself that your experience was outdated, that your ways of doing things were wrong, because it was easier than admitting I didn't know what I was doing and could learn from you. "Elise," I said gently, "being a new parent is overwhelming. I remember that feeling." "But I hurt you," she said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I systematically undermined your relationship with James and made Marcus choose sides instead of standing up for what was right. I took your love for your grandson and turned it into a weapon against you. That was cruel, and I'm deeply sorry." The apology I'd stopped hoping for, delivered with an honesty that made forgiveness not just possible but necessary. "Thank you," I said simply. "That means more than you know." "I want James to grow up knowing how lucky he is to have you as his grandmother," Elise continued. "Not just for special occasions or emergencies, but as a real, everyday part of his life." Standing there in the growing darkness, I realized the trust fund had never really mattered. This moment, this recognition, this respect, this inclusion, was worth more than any financial instrument could ever be. A year later, I sat in Jonathan Richardson's office once again, this time with Marcus and Elise beside me. James, now walking, and chattering constantly, played quietly with blocks on the floor while we discussed something that would have been unimaginable during those dark months of conflict. "So you want to re-establish the trust fund," Jonathan said, reviewing the documents we'd brought, "but with a different structure than the original." "Yes," I said, glancing at Marcus and Elise, who had requested this meeting. "We've all learned something important about what family legacy really means." The new trust was smaller, $200,000 instead of the original $487,000, because I'd already donated $150,000 to the Literacy Council's expansion program and used another $137,000 to establish a scholarship fund at the community college for non-traditional students. The remaining money would still provide for James's education, but it would also require him to participate in community service projects as a condition of receiving funds. "We want him to understand that privilege comes with responsibility," Elise explained, her voice carrying none of the anxiety that had once characterized our conversations. "And we want him to know that his grandmother's values are part of his inheritance, not just her money." But the most significant change wasn't in the trust structure. It was in how we'd reached this decision. Instead of me unilaterally planning James's financial future, we'd spent months discussing our hopes for him, our concerns about raising a child with advantages, and our shared commitment to helping him become a person who contributed to his community rather than simply consuming its benefits. The real legacy, I said, watching James stack blocks with determined concentration, isn't what we leave behind. It's what we pass on while we're still here to see it grow. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.